came to power in 1978. This has propelled China to be the world's largest trading power and one of the most dynamic and innovative economies in the world today. And this has led to geopolitical tension with the United States primarily, but a tension that economists should not respect, because economists believe in win-win, and I believe China's gains are good for the United States and good for the world. But if you are a geostrategist in the United States, you believe China's gains are bad for the U.S. because of diminishing relative U.S. power. There's no doubt the U.S. power in the world is diminished. There's no doubt that China is another option for countries. There's no doubt that most of the developing world does not want a U.S.-led hegemony anyway, but it was living with one, or at least with the U.S. intention of one. And the rise of China changes this fundamentally, because now the balance of power is much more dispersed. The BRICS countries have an output when measured in purchasing power prices that is even slightly larger than the G7 right now. Of course, the BRICS have many more people than the G7, so the per capita income in the G7 is much higher. But just the BRICS is a larger block, around 32% of world output compared to 31% of world output of the G7. U.S.-China tensions have been rising since 2014, and my view is that the U.S. security state already around 2015 began to push for measures to, in the American mindset, contain China. I think there was a change of mindset around that time in the American political and security leadership that said China's continued rise is no longer in America's interest. And a series of measures have been implemented since 2015 that really aim to hinder China's economy and, according to the U.S., hinder China's military capacity, but I think it's more general than that. And those measures include, of course, trying to establish a Trans-Pacific partnership that would exclude China. Rather extraordinary in my mind, almost laughable to make a Pacific Basin trading system designed to exclude China, as if somehow the Chinese economy wasn't there and the 1.4 billion people of China were not there. Of course, the U.S. is constructing new alliances like AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US grouping to base nuclear submarines in Australia, ostensibly to police the South China Sea. The US has imposed technology barriers on China, financial barriers on China. The US has targeted leading Chinese enterprises like Huawei and ZTE. The US is going after TikTok, and now it's going after the cloud services of Alibaba and other major tech companies in China. So why is it doing this? In my view, it is mainly a misguided and a dangerous approach to try to maintain U.S. predominance over China. I think that it is both wrongly directed and almost sure to fail, because China is a very successful society and successful economy with a lot of dynamism. with a lot of scientific and research capacity, with a lot of friends around the world. And the U.S. idea of dominance is not very attractive to most of the world. Most of the world would like good relations with the U.S., but not a U.S. that is dominant. I don't know of countries that are willing to make sacrifices for U.S. dominance other than the close U.S. allies. So when it comes to certainly Chile or Mercosur, Latin America more generally, or UNISUR, the goal for sure is to keep good, open trade relations and financial relations and technology relations with China, and to aim to do the same with the United States and with Europe. I don't think that there is any remotely sensible policy other than the South American countries saying, of course we trade with China normally, of course we're partners with China, but we're also partners with the US and Europe, and we see absolutely no reason to choose sides, and we don't want to be pushed to choose sides. I personally see nothing nefarious in any of China's initiatives, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or others, and I don't believe the Western press, which I regard as mostly propaganda, that the Belt and Road Initiative is a debt trap or Chinese companies are especially harmful to host countries and so forth. So I don't view this as a complicated question, actually, in its substance. I see the U.S. changed its attitude. And when I say the U.S., I mean the security establishment, which runs the U.S. government foreign policy, changed its attitude to China 8 years ago. I do not believe that China provoked that. I don't think it was in response to hostile action from China. I think it was in response to China's success rather than to hostility from China. So I would encourage Chile and Latin America to keep open trade. Every day I say in the United States, maintain relations with China, stop trying to provoke a conflict over Taiwan, stop sending arms to Taiwan. Don't do in Taiwan what we did in Ukraine, which was to create the provocations that led to war, because I also believe that the Ukraine war was caused by U.S. provocations, not by Russian imperial design. Of course, most American leaders violently disagree with me, or maybe not violently, but strongly disagree with me, but I'm old enough that I understand them at this point after almost 50 years of watching U.S. foreign policy, and I think they're wrong, and I think they're provocative. And I don't want them to do the same thing in Taiwan that they've done in Ukraine, which is pump in a lot of arms and then express surprise when a war starts. But that's a possibility that would be a terrible possibility. I believe the U.S. sanction regimes in general are illegal. I do not abide by unilateral coercive measures. My understanding of international law, as reflected in annual votes by the UN General Assembly, is that such sanctions policies are not valid unless adopted by the UN. So I would hope that Latin America would not get trapped in sanctions regimes, but basically would also take the position that nobody can sanction Chile's trade with China, and by the way, Chile's trade with Russia or others, though it's not as important, because if there are to be such sanctions, they're only valid if they're undertaken under the UN Charter, essentially by the UN Security Council. So that's my general view. And my general belief is that trade between South America and China should be strong, and I think it will be mutually beneficial. Latin America, of course, has a resource base which is very complementary to China's. China likes wonderful wine, great fruits, minerals, many wonderful things that Chile specializes in producing. It needs those things, and I think that it will trade and help enrich Chile doing so. At the same time, China has some excellent low-cost infrastructure technologies that I think can be a very great benefit for South America in terms of rolling out 5G, in terms of an integrated zero-carbon power system. China's very good at long-distance direct current high voltage transmission to build an integrated South America-wide zero carbon power system, which Chile could be a very important energy provider to such a system. And so I see many complementarities that are very strong, and hope that Latin America's and South America's trade, finance, diplomatic relations with China remain strong and dynamic. Maybe I'll just stop at that point.
Thank you so much, Professor. May I ask you a question before you leave us, please?
Of course.
What do you think about the evolution of the trade relation between China and the U.S., and what is the impact in issues like the nearshoring, in the global value chains, and what repercussions could that mean to Chile, a country like Chile that is so opened internationally?
Well, the U.S. is trying to create a U.S. alliance for its advanced technology ecosystems, of course, starting with semiconductors, but also with essential vital minerals for the energy transformation, battery supply chains, mineral supply chains, strategic mineral supply chains, and the ability to produce essentially a zero carbon advanced infrastructure, also 5G or 6G. So the U.S. is trying to separate from China's high-end industries, both as a matter of U.S. industrial policy to promote U.S. industry, jobs, and politics, because in the U.S., protectionism against China is deemed by both political parties to be attractive politics because of the vote of the manufacturing sector base in the American Midwest, which is taken to be the swing vote in presidential elections. So both parties now compete on a protectionist line, protecting the jobs of American industry. I think the war in Ukraine has probably exacerbated this, because now the U.S. also sees that the military base in the U.S. is actually not necessarily even competitive with Russia for a conventional war. So I think that there's a rethinking about American industry from the point of view of the armaments sector. Of course, that links to artificial intelligence, it links to the semiconductor sector, it links to the strategic mineral sector, and so forth. So in the U.S. mind, the U.S. is introducing a protectionist industrial policy and a strategic supply chain policy. And Chile will face that, but it's a question how it will face it. It may face it as American companies wanting to create supply chains with Chilean and more generally South American mining, for example, for lithium or for other, for copper, for other resources. That would be fine. Chile will make more money. It will have an export market and so forth. The question is whether the U.S. leans so heavily on Chile to say, well, your supply chain is unacceptable because you have Chinese companies operating in it, and so it hurts our national security. That is a possible approach from the U.S. The language I would use, I cannot repeat over Zoom. If I were to hear such things, it would not be polite and should not be said. But I would reject that approach. Chile by itself will not be in a position to reject that approach necessarily. But it's really important for South America to reform a political union and an UNESUR that brings together Mercosur and the Andean countries is really important because actually South America needs a political base for geopolitical dialogue, and it doesn't have it right now. In my opinion, thanks God Bolsonaro is gone because he was playing the game of division. I also personally, just to show you how, how at odds I am with the way the U.S. thinks right now, the U.S. strategists think, I think the U.S. attempt to bring down Maduro and to divide the continent between the pro-Maduro side and the anti-Maduro side was tremendously stupid, cynical, self-destructive, aimed mainly at the Florida electoral votes in the 2020 election more than anything else, and very bad for South America because it divided South America between the leftist regimes, the rightist regimes, and what South America needs is a unified strategy right now, both in geopolitics, in trade negotiations, in finance, and in the physical infrastructure connectivity. Because South America should be building an integrated zero carbon energy system that brings in Chile's photovoltaics, that brings in Brazil's hydropower, that brings in the Caribbean basin wind. This is great. This would be a terrific resource, but it requires regional cooperation. Put aside labels, put aside ideology, go make investments. And that's what I would recommend. And I don't want the U.S. to meddle in that. And China may be a part of some of that supply chain. And I would say that's great. That's fine. China will help invest. They'll also bring technology, physical infrastructure. I like Huawei, for example. I'd say go build out a 5G system based on Huawei. That freaks out the U.S. They can't spy on you as well if you have Huawei. That's my interpretation. They say China's going to spy. I think the issue is the U.S. won't be able to spy as effectively. So I think that they're real issues, but I hope that South America can become more politically proactive, integrated, negotiating, and basically saying we want good relations with all other regions. That would be my recommended policy.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Well, that's a wishful thinking, that we will.
I know.
We have been trying for ages to organize ourselves, and none of the different projects has succeeded, except for the Pacific Alliance at one point. But it was more a trade and not that politically oriented. But still, it was very successful for a while. But the changes of government made it. It has not died, but it's not surviving that as healthy as it was.
If I could say the importance of regional cooperation is really an order of magnitude higher than even a generation ago, and for two basic reasons. South America really needs to confront the giants now. You've got negotiations with the EU. You've got strategic issues with the US. You have strategic issues with China. You have strategic issues with India will be there soon. And so you cannot do this one country at a time. It's not possible. So that's one reason. And the second reason is we need continental scale infrastructure now for the power sector, for hydrogen, for other core infrastructure, for protecting the Amazon basin. And so the logic of regional cooperation from a public goods point of view is also extremely important. So I hope that all politicians at that level could be very pragmatic and say, yes, we each have our own domestic politics, but we face the outside world really in a structurally similar way. And we all have to work together on our infrastructure that links the region together.
Yeah, it's true. Professor, if Margaret can ask you one question and then we will let you go, but only.
Of course.
Please, thank you so much.
Thank you for the time, and I'll be very quick. No, I just wonder what you think. Obviously, the national security establishment in the U.S. has fundamental in shaping and crafting and advancing a certain China policy, and wide-ranging and shaping other foreign policy as well. But I wonder what you think of this, these arguments that we hear among the private sector that, which are of, two minds about this. There is a considerable interest, obviously, in continuing to engage with China, a huge market, especially for certain types of industries, right? And a real need to engage there, frankly. But on the other hand, a sense that they are unable to compete in the region, depending obviously on what industry we're talking about, and and a real effort on the part of certain industries to promote policy, legislation that will be supportive, again, of their interests. So industrial policy, as you mentioned, I'm thinking of the CHIPS Act, for example. So I mean, what do you think of this argument? Do you see validity in this argument that there is an impossibility, frankly, to compete with China given the structure of that economy and the way that China engages with the region, unless these policies are adopted?
Yeah, I think first, we really should be in an ongoing negotiation with China on many different issues. And these issues are not simple. And China has a different structure of public policy and politics that is real, valid, rather successful, and requires us to work on rules of the road together with China. So I don't want to oversimplify. I think in general, China's rise over the last 40 years was done the real way through hard work and large-scale investment. The scale of China's saving, physical investment, building core infrastructure, smart planning, massive upscaling of science and technology and education levels is the core of what has happened, not cheating or stealing intellectual property and so forth. But China has a semi-planned economy, very smart, and it definitely raises issues that we should be negotiating. I'm so naive that I believe in the World Trade Organization even. I think we should have global negotiations over industrial policy and so forth. I don't want to give up on WTO, but we don't even mention it basically anymore. So I don't want to deny that there are issues and that they're complex. I don't think that they're a basis for unilateralism, a basis for containment, a basis for hostility, or a basis for war. So I would like to put that in perspective. Second, the interests of major U.S. companies is quite varied. I spoke with one of our major tech companies last week. I won't put them on the spot to say which one. But really one of the companies at the center of all discussion right now. They were aghast at U.S. policymaking. I asked them questions. Why is the Commerce Department doing X, Y, and Z? And their top lawyer said to me, Jeff, if we only knew. They don't talk to us. It makes no sense. We try to tell them they're going to kill our major market in China. Do they have any idea what they're doing? And it was quite impressive, by the way. This was a big, major company. And what they were telling me was not what you would expect to hear. I don't think it was a political thing. It was an exasperation with the U.S. Commerce Department. He said they don't have a clue. They don't understand. How do we, I don't want to give away more than I should, but he said, we succeed by innovation. How do we innovate? We invest a fortune in R&D. How do we invest a fortune in R&D? We make a lot of money. How do we make a lot of money? We sell to China, thank you. So they're going to break our whole model by putting on these restrictions when they think that this is somehow good for us. It's the opposite of what we need. Our model is stay one step ahead through smart R&D, not through protectionism. And so it was interesting for me. I reached out to them to try to understand their position on these issues, and I got an earful that was completely consistent with what I naively believed before talking to them. That's an example of one, but it's one of the companies absolutely at the center of current discussion right now, and they were completely exasperated. They were not thinking the U.S. was representing them at all. They thought they're thinking the U.S. is going to kill their major market, stupidly, for no reason, and that the U.S. authorities had no idea how they really have kept ahead of the game. That is interesting.
Yeah, it seems that there is a disconnection on both sides, no, and it's very unfortunate. And
by the way, there are two parts of America. One I don't really understand, but I kind of understand it. The other part I understand better, but there is a real security state, which I'm not in the room, God forbid. But it's a crazy kind of thinking from my point of view. And I don't feel they're making me any safer. I've been through too many U.S. wars now in my lifetime to believe these people, even though they're generals. Okay, with all respect, I don't believe them. Then there's the part I know something about, which is economic policy, and they are not on top of the game. I'm sorry. There's a lot of naivete and a lot of dusting off the Soviet Union playbook as if China's the same thing. And it seems to me to be an anachronism of about 40 years.
Wow. That is major statement. And we hope that this gap shortens soon enough before more harm is made. And countries like ours are very dependent on what's going on in the players. So for us, that's why we're having this webinar actually right now. We're very concerned of what could be the effects in our economy, in our trade, and it's not easy. And it's not easy where we're located. You mentioned that the need to organize ourselves in South America or Latin America, and that's also very difficult given the governments that we have right now. It's very complicated.
Yeah. One thing to remember that I think is useful is Brazil will have the G20 presidency next year. This is a real opportunity for the region to get together also. I happen to be a big fan of President Lula, and I was just watching him at work in Paris last week at the Finance Summit. I think Brazil can really play a constructive role internationally as one of the BRICS and within South America as a constructive, really constructive, smart, unifying force. I know because of all the politics, everyone's on different sides, but there's an opportunity here that should not be missed.
We're looking closely to what the steps Lula is giving in the international arena. It's clear that he wants to have a kind of a leadership in this, and I hope that we take advantage of that as well. Professor Sachs, there's one thing that it's something that is going on right now. It has to do with the accession of China to the CPTPP. Do you think that a country like Chile should support that accession?
I've not looked at detailed issues, actually. In general, actually, I should not talk about any of the details of the negotiations because I'm not in a position to advise.
Okay, but politically, do you think that it's convenient that China accesses the CPTPP? It's something that...
In general, we should trade with China. In general, the whole idea that China is outside of the trade arrangements is crazy. China is the major trading country. And I'll just give you one insight that for me is useful. In 2015, a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Robert Blackwell, who's a leading American diplomat, and I'd say one of our main geopolitical strategists, wrote a paper for the Council on Foreign Relations about U.S.-China relations. And he wrote in that paper, America's grand strategy is to be the dominant power. China's threatening that. We need to contain China. And he listed what the U.S. should do. That list, which is 8 years old, is the game plan that they're following. So it said in the list, make trade arrangements that do not include China. Put on commodity export bans. Raise tariff rates. Build military alliances around the region. There's a list of measures, usually in papers of the Council on Foreign Relations. You're actually reading not the author's wish list, but the Washington policy being exposed that way. So I think what Blackwell was telling us is here's the new U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. And one of the key points was make trade arrangements that exclude China. And of course, this is what we have been at for 8 years now. I can't even describe how ridiculous I think this is. I was at this meeting here in the Vatican. I said it was something like a 7th grade club that tries to get together to say, okay, we're not letting that person in our club. This is the level of thinking. How can you have trade where China's not part of the discussion? It's ridiculous. It's so artificial. It's so naive. By the way, it's exactly on the level of the United States declaring one day that Maduro is no longer president, Juan Guaido is president. This is something that only the fantasists in Washington could come up with, that they decide to name a different Venezuelan president and then take that seriously. And by the way, half of Latin America signed up to that idea with the United States because they sign up to whatever silly thing the United States does. And I wrote to my friends that day, I said, are you kidding? And they said, no, this is very real. And of course, it was absurd. That's the same thing with U.S. trade policy. We need trade relations with China. China should be part of any regional trade strategy, period, because they're the main trade country. Because we don't hate China, we like China. We want China to play by rules, but not our rules that as a group we commonly set. That's the difference. We keep thinking we're going to set the rules and do it our way. And that is a world from 50 years ago.
Yeah, well, needless is to say that also the U.S. should be part of the CPTPP.
There you go. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. It's something, it was unthinkable for all of us when you left the agreement. And we hope that...
What happened was, well, of course, Trump's proved to the Democrats that free trade was bad politics. And now the Democrats are all trying to prove that they're good protectionists. And so trade became an evil word. And the reason is when we teach trade theory, which I've taught for 40 years, you teach two things simultaneously. Trade raises national income, but it redistributes it. So you better have redistributive policies together with your trade. And the United States doesn't understand that. It doesn't understand that in addition to trade, you take care of people through Social Security or healthcare or social housing or other things. So the U.S. doesn't have any redistributive part. So the trade hurts some regions, and that turns us protectionist. And rather than having regional and social policies, the United States has turned against trade. That's our problem right now. And, it's the first day of trade theory that they refuse to understand, and it makes it quite difficult.
Yeah. Paulina, you want to ask something about OMC? Go ahead, please.
Hi, good morning. No, you just answered my question in some way, because I was about to ask you about the role of WTO here. And because I really share with you that, that organization should be great if it's functioning well. But right now needs, under my point of view, a huge reconstruction in terms of what, trade has been norm. And I think the idea to push the WTO right now is exactly the same direction that we would like to China play by the rules, but play by the rule in a multipolar world. So
exactly. Yes. So the issue on many things, the United States was at the center of the international policy making. Now it doesn't want global rules. It wants only US made rules. And it doesn't, since it's trying to corner China, it doesn't want globally made rules in which China participates. This is a syndrome all over the system, whether it's inside the UN, WTO, World Bank. In many areas, the US doesn't want multilateralism now because multilateralism means multipolarity. But what Chile and the rest of the world needs to say to the US is, calm down, you're still powerful, you're still rich, don't get so upset. China's not taking you over. We all need to sit at the table together. And this is what the US has to hear from the rest of the world. Not, you're so great, we follow you wherever you go. And this is where we're heading. We're heading towards a multipolar world. But the US is being brought there a bit kicking and screaming, I would say.
Professor, what would you say that are the actual and most critical risks for global trade nowadays? What could you single out as the one of the top on the top in your view?
Well, the top is war, because the war in Ukraine could be replayed in East Asia, and we're actually heading towards that because the U.S. political class wants to arm Taiwan massively, and if it does so, there will be war because China won't sit back and let the phrase that is used is that we should make Taiwan a porcupine, so stuffed with weapons that China couldn't attack it. The whole idea is, again, a ridiculous idea. There's no way you could make it enough of a porcupine that it would stop the mainland, first of all. Second, the more you pump Taiwan.
How to improve human lives is not a theory of everything. At best, it's a theory of some things, but not a theory of everything. In this wider, more humanitarian spirit, today we have the honor of setting physics aside and talking to one of the most accomplished and admirable persons in terms of his commitment to human well-being, and especially to the well-being of the world's most vulnerable people. His name is David Sachs, a world-renowned economics professor at Columbia University and a leading global authority on sustainable development. Time magazine named Sachs as one of the top 100 most influential world leaders, not once, but twice. Let me tell you a quick story about Professor Sachs so you get a feel for the kind of person he is. I originally invited him to come onto the channel to talk about the war in Ukraine. A couple of minutes before we started recording, however, I asked him if I could start with a hard question that I thought might help silence his critics. He said sure, and I was just about to tell him the question so he wasn't caught off guard, but he stopped me firmly and said he didn't want to know the question ahead of time. He told me to just ask. I honestly was not expecting this. Sachs talks a lot about Aristotelian virtue, and I saw quickly in this simple but difficult act that it's not just talk. He walks the walk. If you think doing something like this is simple, try recording an interview where your life and your work are questioned critically and tell the person you don't want to know the questions ahead of time. It's easier said than done. In any case, this small story and the situation in Ukraine that we're going to talk about may seem a bit removed from the science we've been covering with the last few guests, but it's actually intimately connected. In fact, that's one of the main arguments of this channel. I've begun to spell this argument out with the past guests such as Michael Levin and Carl Friston, but the most compelling parts of the argument are yet to come, including a conversation with Fields medalist Michael Friedman on his proposal to connect the mathematics of quantum theory with politics and social choice. That's coming. For now, in this exchange, simply take note of the courage and conviction with which Sachs expresses his ideas that he knows are not going to be popular. Apparently, he doesn't care about being popular, and that's part of what makes him a great soul, in my opinion. He makes a tremendous amount of sense in many of the things he says, and his commitment to serving the world's most vulnerable people, in my opinion, should serve as an example for leaders in general. Leaders, after all, are meant to serve and not to be served. As always, you'll find a timestamp as well as a more complete version of Professor Sachs' impressive biography and other relevant links in the video description. Thanks again for your time and interest. Professor Sachs, welcome to our channel at the European Institute of Science and Management. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Professor, we've agreed to talk about war and sustainability. If it's okay, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to set up our exchange. Our central mission at ASIM is to engage with the general public and with leading thinkers like yourself about the physical and mathematical foundations of effective management. We think of management in the broadest sense to include not only business, of course, but the ecology and science, politics, and of course, war. From our perspective, basically anything that exists falls under the rubric of management. So existence here is a key word because it's not going to do anybody any good to talk about management or sustainability if in the end we destroy ourselves and there's nobody around to manage anything. So you have a series of really important messages to convey in this regard, not only to Americans, but to Europe as well. Before we get to your message, however, allow me to confess a deep, heartfelt sympathy and gratitude for your lifelong work on behalf of the most vulnerable people of the world. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, very nice. Appreciate that.
What's unfortunate, in my opinion, that in spite of all your work, there are some groups, I'm thinking in particular of the followers of people like Thomas Sowell from the prestigious Hoover Institute at Stanford, who believe that Harvard-trained consultants who never have to pay the price for giving bad advice end up harming the world more than helping. To bring some of these skeptics back into the fold, how would you respond to this? I have my own response, but I think yours is more important.
Well, I think we each do the best we can, and that's all that I try to do. I've been working towards a fairer planet and fighting poverty of my career. I went into this field of economics, now sustainable development, believing that it would be possible to make a contribution. I think that part of the question is motivation. I was just reflecting today, actually, before our call, my social welfare function, as we describe it in economics, is the world, not so much my country, especially. I've always felt the United States is rich enough; it should behave better and take care of itself. But we have a whole world of humanity that is trying to find a place on this planet, and I'm trying my best to help those who are less heard, who have less access, who have great needs. And also, in the course of my work now spanning more than well over 125 countries, actually around 140 countries, I've seen the world from many different perspectives and believe that one of our greatest challenges is just living together in a civil way and understanding each other. So that's become another part of my own approach and my own work. So it's fine to have critics. It's fine that there are critics. I think we just each have to do our best.
Fantastic. I would add to that, to the critics, I normally say one has to take a position, even in the extreme scenario of a libertarian paradise where there's no government. This just seems so absolutely unrealistic that even that itself is a position. So
of course, it's by the way, it's a 18th century outmoded ideology and philosophy that came from Britain in a very strange period of political philosophy, and it, we should have grown up from that by now. But in any event, let me also say I'm not a Harvard consultant. I happen to teach at Columbia University. I've been quite critical of Harvard and, in fact, many elite institutions that they don't do what they need to do. So I just want to clarify that for people listening as well.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for answering that difficult question. So with that, we can turn to the main message, which is the threat of an escalated war. Can you tell us your thoughts about this, and what are some of the main ideas that you would like to communicate to listeners?
I think the main point to understand is that the war in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia to a very large extent. It's a competition that has now turned deadly between two superpowers over who will control this place that is in between Russia and the European Union. And it didn't have to turn so ugly. In my opinion, it was provoked in no small part by the American insistence that not only the European Union should expand, but that NATO should expand. This is something that I've opposed for a very long time. Why is the U.S. pushing a military alliance up to the border of Russia when Russia has said for 30 years, don't do that? This is our national security. We don't want your military alliance on our border. And yet the United States persisted. In 2008, George W. Bush Jr. Insisted that NATO commit to enlarge to Ukraine and even to the nation of Georgia, which is on the other side of the Black Sea, way to the east. And Russia said, you're surrounding us. This is our national security. You're encircling us in the Black Sea where our naval fleet is. Don't do this. Then in 2013 and 2014, the United States contributed to the overthrow of a pro-Russian president in Ukraine. That was another step on the way to this war. And so we've been escalating on both sides. Let's be clear. For 3 decades, actually, the United States has been provoking, Russia has been reacting, and now we are really in a hot war of mass destruction in Ukraine, which is a tragedy for Ukraine. It's a country caught in the middle, actually. And these kinds of battles of will between superpowers can escalate. And we hear talk every day, well, will there be nuclear attacks? Will nuclear weapons be used? It's unbelievable to have that kind of daily chit-chat, if I can, about something that is existential for the planet. I spent a lot of my life thinking about and studying the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I wrote a book called To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that we came within a hair's breadth of nuclear destruction, and even the leaders weren't really in control of events completely. And it ended only by diplomacy. It didn't end by the United States winning and the Soviet Union losing. It ended by the US withdrawing its nuclear weapons from Turkey, while the Soviet Union withdrew its nuclear weapons from Cuba. So there are lots of lessons from that we need to take on board 60 years later in our current conflict. But strangely enough, I understand the US, it's all gung-ho war, we're going to defeat Putin. That's the American way. It's naive, typically a massive failure, whether in Vietnam or Iraq or Syria or Libya or many other places. But why is Europe signing on to this the same way? That to me has been a bit of a mystery. Where are people in Europe, especially leaders in Europe, saying, look, we need to negotiate the end of this war. The war needs to stop. NATO does not need to enlarge. We need other ways for Ukraine to have its security, but we don't need a proxy war between two superpowers. That's what I'd like to hear from European leaders.
Very good. So you are an economics professor. What are, in your opinion, are the what are the economics that are driving the situation?
I don't think economics really are the major driver. I think U.S. ideology is the major driver. The U.S. ideology is one of empire. It's been that way since really the founding of the United States, even before 1787, when our Constitution was adopted, or 1776, when we had the so-called War of Independence. From the first settlements, the idea was that the white settlers on the eastern seaboard of North America would expand westward. There happened to be lots of nations westward. They were indigenous American nations. That did not perturb the white settlers, and it didn't perturb the United States of America, which in the 19th century systematically routed and in some cases committed genocide against Native American populations. When that so-called manifest destiny of continental conquest was over, almost to the moment that that was completed, the U.S. looked for adventures overseas, and it launched the war against Spain in 1898, a deliberate war in order to take new colonial possessions, which included Puerto Rico, Cuba temporarily, and the Philippines for several decades. And that began America's overseas adventures. Now, it's a complicated story. I don't want to oversimplify, but since World War II, the American state elite has had the view that America is the superpower that should run the world. Of course, there was a Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1991. When the Soviet Union ended, the U.S. said, we won, now we're the unipolar power, now we get to do what we want. And they launched several more wars in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and so forth. These were basically premeditated wars that was described by the Project for a New American Century as eliminating those residual regimes like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad, who were allies of the Soviet Union or allies of Russia. Well, these have been debacles. They've cost the U.S. trillions of dollars. None of them has solved any political problems. And so when you ask, what are the economic drivers? There aren't. It's just this view fundamentally that America is only safe if America dominates. That's an imperial vision. When you're an empire or quasi-empire like the U.S. is, which has military bases in more than 80 countries, every country next door to where you are is a risk to where you're already located. So there's this natural tendency to say, oh my God, well, we're this far, but we need to be that far. In other words, NATO extends to Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, but it needs to extend to Ukraine and to Georgia too. It needs to keep moving. And I recently was at a conference where a NATO official, looking a little bit like a Star Wars official from the dark forces, said, we will succeed in our efforts in Ukraine and onward to Eurasia, or something like that. And it was, what? This was actually at an economics and ecology conference, and I wondered why a NATO official was even speaking at such a conference. So I'm a critic of U.S. foreign policy. I don't think it serves American interests. I don't think it actually, in this case, even serves the corporate interests, although maybe some people would say in some ways it does. You could say, well, how about General Dynamics and Raytheon and the rest of the military industrial complex? But I don't think that that's actually the main motive of this. The main motive is an ideology of statecraft, that the United States should be all over the world, basically running the show as the world's sole superpower. Of course, it's not only coming up against barriers in with Russia and Ukraine, but also with China. And the United States and when I say the US, what I mean is a small elite that is in the senior security positions of the state. They resent China. You know, how can that country be so large and technologically advancing? That's a threat to the United States' well-being. It's a very arrogant position. There happen to be 1.4 billion Chinese. We should wish them well. We should wish them prosperity. We should wish them the ability to live a good life. But instead, in the United States, it's viewed as a threat. So we have, perhaps it could be completely disastrous, a war coming over Taiwan, because we're again in this idea that the United States has to stick its face right up against China and declare this or that in someone's next door. And it's, to my mind, not economically driven. That's the very long answer to a very good question.
Okay, so from what I gather, one of the central challenges is a question of leadership, effective leadership. Have you given much thought to this concept of leadership, and especially a branch of economics you'll know as social choice theory, and how we come to collective decisions? Does this influence your thinking or your work in any way?
It does, quite fundamentally. You know, social choice theory is a framework that takes some philosophical premises that I don't especially care for. And I'll put it this way. In Western cultural tradition, there have been different strands of ideas about politics, and different strands of ideas about economics. And without going into a long digression, back in ancient Greece, which is one of the foundational pillars of our civilization, Aristotle talked about, and Plato talked about, politics for the common good, and talked about the idea that we need a citizenry of virtue so that people would respond for the common good. And the whole question of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's politics is the question, how do you make a political system for the common good in which there is virtue in the public? Well, 1800 years later, in around 1500, a very different political philosophy was written down, and that's Machiavelli's philosophy. And that is, how do you fight for power in The Prince? This is quite different from what the Republic of Plato or the politics of Aristotle was about. It wasn't about the common good. It was about power and the question of how to allocate power. When you come up to our modern economic thinking, it derives heavily from 17th and 18th century British thought. And that's because Britain ended up becoming the hegemonic power of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. So what happened in Britain affected all Western thinking, including how we teach economics. And the idea in this British philosophical thought is, we have our preferences, each person is different, they're fighting for advantage. Maybe market forces or political forces will be the way that one fights for their personal advantage. Very different from the Greek approach, which is cultivate virtue so that there is a sense of the common good. Rather, it's how to operate on individual preferences, which somehow come from someplace, not cultivated, not developed out of virtue, but that's you. And you, through the marketplace or through political competition, fight for advantage. Social choice theory takes that framework and says, okay, people have many different tastes. We're a pluralistic society. How can we put the pieces together? And Kenneth Arrow, who was my professor of microeconomics, said, impossible.
Wow.
And so, he said, you can't do it. Different people, different tastes. There is no single system to aggregate. My idea goes back to Aristotle, which is, we would be a lot better off if we were cultivating a sense of responsibility, if we had ethics as key. Remember that Aristotle's Politics was a companion volume to his Nicomachean Ethics. So the idea is that if we behave better, if we cultivate virtues better, then we can solve our social dilemmas better. And I think that there's a lot of truth to this. This, of course, is very much part of Christian philosophy as well, because Christian philosophy and Catholic social teachings are very relational. They don't say, well, you have two people, now you need a social welfare function, how these two people are going to collide and who's going to come out on top and who's going to come out next. Rather, Pope Francis, in his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, says if you want to get along with the other, encounter the other. In other words, you make dialogue, you discuss, you empathize, you try to understand things from the perspective of the other side. This was Jesus's teachings also, of course, in the Beatitudes. And so, to my mind, this is a very different approach from the Machiavellian or the British philosophy, Hobbes and Hume and Smith, who said, well, people are different, they collide, and it's through the market forces or political competition that those collisions work themselves out. The Greek and Christian philosophy is much more virtue-based and relational. And it says, try to work out your differences through empathy, through understanding of interdependence, and so forth. Now, that may sound naive because in our world, power is power, money is money. But I don't think it's so naive, because I think the approach we are using, which is that geopolitics is just tough collisions of nations and markets are just tough collisions of autonomous Homo economicus, I don't think it works very well. I don't think it's delivering safety for us. It's not delivering sustainable development. It's not ending poverty. So to be called naive to want something else, to my mind, isn't naive. It's just reform-minded.
Great. Professor, you've been nice enough to grant us 30 minutes. One last question. You are currently in Vienna, and you've mentioned Pope Francis and his important work for the environment and the ecology and Laudato Si, etc. What are some of the most interesting things taking place now in Europe in terms of sustainability, development, these types of issues?
Europe has the most creative framework for sustainable development in the world in the European Green Deal. The European Commission came up with a program, and actually the European Council, of course, adopted it and backed it with funding for an energy transition to a decarbonized energy system, for sustainable land use in the so-called farm to fork program, for circular economy, for responsible global value chains, for digital access, and for innovation. I really admire the European Green Deal. I want Europe to get back to the business of sustainable development in the European Green Deal and away from this awful war in Ukraine, which has become the dominant issue of politics, of course, in 2022. The war needs to end so that Europe can get back to the European Green Deal. And my proposition to the European leaders is, you've made something really important for sustainable development. Take it on the road, in the sense that Latin America needs a Green Deal. ASEAN needs a Green Deal. The African Union needs this. This should be Europe's diplomacy in the decade ahead, not NATO expansion, not war, not confrontation with China. All of that is American misdirection, I'm sorry to say. Europe should lead on sustainable development because it's the region of the world farthest along in both the values of sustainable development and the practicalities of how to accomplish it.
Excellent, excellent. Professor, what can the average person in Europe do to further these objectives?
Two things. First, call on your political leaders to push for negotiations. Don't believe in this idea, we're going to defeat Putin, a country, by the way, with 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Call for a negotiated end to this war that protects Ukraine's interests, but also stops the NATO enlargement and ends the war. This is one point. Second, work on sustainable development, on the sustainable development goals in your cities, in your business, in your universities, in your communities, and support the European Green Deal, which really is a remarkable achievement for 27 disparate countries to have come together for such a clear-sighted approach to sustainable development.
Fantastic. Professor, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much. You've been extremely generous. We wish you the best. Can people follow you? What kind of presence do you have online?
I don't tweet because I don't believe we can discuss issues in 140 characters. So I have a website where I post all my articles. I blog a lot. I think it's jeffsachs.org or jeffdsachs.org. I think it's jeffsachs.org. And people can write to me at my university email address also to follow.